Well, welcome once again to Artwork, everyone. If you haven't already seen it, hopefully you'll take the opportunity to view the exhibition Expressions in Paper and Clay, which is currently on display in the lower level in the Light Gallery of Oriental Arts. And as the title suggests, it's really a two-part exhibit. First, it consists of contemporary Japanese prints from the collection of Joy and Tim Light. And then also it includes a promised gift of contemporary Japanese ceramics from the Carol and Jeffrey Horvitz collection. And their collection is really exceptional. It's the largest collection of contemporary Japanese ceramics outside of Japan. So getting something from them is really wonderful. Well, today, to provide really an in-depth look at both prints and ceramics, we're very fortunate to have with us Julie Devers and Deborah Mattson. Julie is the head of the KIA Ceramics program, and in addition, she teaches a class in the amagama technique, which is a traditional Japanese method of wood firing ceramics. And Deborah is the head of the KIA printmaking program. She works primarily in intaglio and lithography, as well as bookmaking. So the fact that I think they're both practicing artists really lends special insight they can provide to this exhibit, and they'll explore really both the techniques and the aesthetics of this really interesting exhibit. So I think we're going to start with Deborah talking about prints. So if you'll welcome them both, we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'm going to go to my first slide here, so you don't have to look at that. Just that header. So I'll be talking about the Japanese prints that are in this exhibit. Before I start talking about these specific prints, I just want to kind of basically go over, because I think some people haven't learned a lot about printmaking, or maybe you just need a review, but to talk an overview of printmaking in general. When fine artists talk about printmaking, what they're usually talking about is creating 2D images in multiples. So as opposed to just doing a painting or a drawing, they've created images and they make an addition, they make multiples of that image. Most of I believe all of the prints that are down in this present exhibit, they're all parts of an edition, so we know for sure that they definitely were multiple prints. So there's a term I'm going to be using, and I'll be talking about a matrix. And the matrix is what the artist or the printmaker prepares to make prints off of. For example, if you were just making thumbprints, your thumb is the matrix. If you're carving a block of wood to make prints, that block of wood is the matrix. So when I use that term, I'm using that is the wood or the stone, whatever the printmaker is using to make the prints from. Now, the other two things I like to mention when talking about prints to help you with your appreciation, and this is something you can always be thinking about when you look at prints, is that for one thing, making a matrix, the matrix is always the mirror image of the print itself. So remember when you look at prints that the artist was actually working in reverse to create a matrix to make the print. And that's especially important when you think about things like text, like a portrait like this, where you want to recognize the person, landscapes, architectural details. There are some images where it doesn't matter right to left, but many of them do. So remember, appreciate that the printmaker is having to think in reverse that way. The other thing about printmaking is that if you see any print with more than one color, it means that the artist has had to make a matrix for every color. So again, they're not only just making one in reverse to print, black and white is what you might usually see, but every time you're adding a color, you're adding one more matrix in that has to be registered and printed in the series. So I'm throwing that out there to you so you can just kind of remember this presentation whenever you look at prints. I think it helps your appreciation of what you're looking at. So the first artist that I wanted to start with this presentation was Naoko Matsubara. This is a self-portrait. And I wanted to start with her because I kind of went through these printmakers and I wanted to present them in an order that, to me, represented Japanese printmaking as a whole. Generally, when I think of Japanese printmaking, I think of the methods they would use to print fabric, like kimonos, or to do the real famous Japanese printmaking that a lot of you might think of when you're thinking of Japanese prints, which is woodblock. So I'm starting with the two woodblock artists and then going on to the silkscreen and lithography. So Naoko Matsubara, she was born in 1937, currently lives in Canada. The type of printing that she did, she was part of a movement in Japan. It was called Sasaku Hanga. And what that refers to is that the artists were creating their own matrices. They were also printing them themselves. So they kind of had their hand on the entire printmaking process. And that's kind of a little different from traditional Japanese printmaking, which is ukiyo-e. And when you think of some of the famous Japanese printmakers, for example, like Hokusai, Horashiga, probably the most famous example is the famous wave print that was Hokusai. Those are the ukiyo-e prints. And what that means is that the artist was responsible for the first original drawing, but then he had a whole workshop of helpers that were carvers and printers. So it was kind of a team effort. And some of these Sasaku Hanga artists wanted to start exploring was kind of what you see a lot in Western printmaking tradition, where the artist comes up with the image, creates the matrix, and prints it all themselves. So pointing out the self-portrait, again, you might, Naoko Matsubara, she's holding the tool of her trade. She's holding a carving knife. And just remembering that holding it in her right hand means that she originally carved this holding it in her left. It's kind of just little things you're going to look for to realize that, you know, what they had to carve versus what they were printing. And Naoko also carved a lot of her wood, I understand, without a preparatory drawing. She just jumped right in and start carving. So all the more reason to really expect the craftsmanship of what she's doing. You'll see the little red mark on the bottom. You see that a lot on Asian prints, some Western prints. It's a chop mark. And that just means that's more like a stamp, or it's something that she would print in red and add that as she was printing. And it's more it's like her signature trademark on her prints. So this is one of the prints that you'll see downstairs. This is crabapple. Again, a 3-color print, meaning all of the blocks had to be carved and then registered as she was printing. And one of the features I really like about this print are those little circular shapes and marks that she uses throughout the print. And you'll see that in some of the other prints down there. She did a lot of prints of trees. So this is a good example of that. I also wanted to include, this print is not downstairs. It's from Portland Art Museum. I just wanted to include another example. But again, it really shows how she can just carve from wood some simple shapes that really convey the shape and the spirit of the tree. And what I really like about this is the way she did the reflection. This print, Solitude, is from a series that Naoko did when she visited Walden Pond, where Thoreau lived for so long in solitude. And she made a series of prints about all the trees around that pond. So that's why you get the reflection. And I just like the way the gray kind of goes into the darkness with the horizontal water lines. So it just very simply but effectively conveys that reflection. So again, it's just another example from a different collection that shows her work with doing the trees. This is a print downstairs, Mayoko Adori. This is a festival in Kyoto in April, and it's where the geisha, or the art dancers, will come out and perform dances. It's just very famous. It's a very celebratory time. And again, you can see she's made a print using black and red, and then very effectively carved out so the white of the paper comes through as the third color. Again, I really love her use of the little circular shapes. I looked at some photographs of this festival. She really captures the stage, how the dancers come out, and then those little rhythmic curves that kind of are like the heads of the people watching. She very often did these prints. She had a background in the Shinto religion, so she would do shrines, festivals, and places in Japan that were really important to her. I also wanted to mention that you might notice that this is kind of a more simpler folk art style than some of the Japanese prints that you're used to. This is a style called minjei, which is more folk art than the very formal carving that you might see in the ukiyo-e prints. And then this print, Nishiki, is also in Nakoto. This is a really famous food market. And we call this a white line print because very often in relief printmaking, which are what these wood blocks are, you will carve away. I'm just going to go back once. For example, with these blocks, in the black, she's carved away everything but what she wanted to print black. And the red, she carved away everything but what she wanted to print red, leaving behind the white. And this, she's kind of used her carving tool as a drawing instrument. So rather than take away negative space, she's used it to draw the lines, the textures of the roofs and the signage and the people walking through the market. Again, I was just thinking, because I don't read Japanese, but I was just looking at every character and wondering if she took the trouble to visualize it backwards or carve it backwards, which to me would be very challenging, just to off of your head to start carving the reverse image of text. But again, you see her chat mark there. So in all of these, the prints of Naoku Matsubara, you see kind of that traditional Japanese wood carving, the folk art, the patterning, those things that you would expect. So a very, very beautiful set of prints. I'm going to move on to the next artist. And this is Raika Awami. These are also wood blocks, but you can tell it's a very different style. They're more abstract. And Awami lived from 27 to 2020, as she was very highly regarded as a Japanese printmaker. Still is. But what you'll notice about these abstract prints is just a very elegant formality about them. They're very beautiful, and just that really subdued use of color, just a very subdued palette. And what she usually was exploring as a printmaking theme was water, how water looks. This particular print is the Water of June. And something that she was very talented with, it's very impressive, is how she used the wood grain to express the streams of water. So you can look at that and you recognize it as wood, but also as how water looks when it streams. And if you think about how Japanese art is usually it's very focused on the beauty of nature. In fact, all of Japanese culture recognizes that. This is something that she has captured in her prints. I want to point out, the kind of white layers, not the color of the paper. But if you see that in person, if you go down and look at it, as kind of a glitter to it. She used mica. She printed with mica, and then the gold. I was thinking it was gold leaf, but I did some research, and some Japanese printmakers will use a powdered metal, like a powdered bronze or silver, and they will print with that. So kirazuri is the Japanese printing process of adding the mica. And again, she's carved these different blocks of color. And then when you go to print on the metal or the mica, you'll just apply some glue to the block to print the ink color. And then you'll add some glue as if the glue were ink. And you'll sprinkle the metal powder or the mica on that. And then when it prints, the glue picks up the mica or the gold, and then that becomes part of the print. I was also talking with Julie, and she pointed out it reminded her of this, is it kintsugi, where the Japanese will mend old pots with gold, like they'll fuse the gold in. And it also reminded us of that too, how putting that layer of gold, that piece of gold in with the earthier colors. So this is Water of June. Dialogue with Water G, and again you see kind of that streaming of the wood grain, creating that water look. And hopefully you can see too that on the right side of the print there's like a mirror image of that wood, and that's an embossment, meaning that she printed part of her block without putting ink on it, and just the pressure of the printing picked up that dimensionality of the block without actually putting the ink on. And I'm guessing what she did here is that she had a board that, I'm trying to think of the term when you can slice the board open and get the mirror image on either side of the grain. I'm guessing she used one half of the dark ink and then the other half just for embossment and with the mica printing. And then you have, again, that gold in the center. And then this last one of hers is Ode to Water. And again, she's used the wood to kind of, to me, almost create kind of a goblet shape. And the water's flowing in these different directions, like over the top and then, down into the column. It just kind of captures the different ways water flows, whether horizontally, vertically. And then you've got that bright spot of gold, whether that's the reflection of light or just a glimmer of water. And just the layering of the different colors is really beautiful. And just all of her work, all of Awami's work, it just really has that refinement to it. It was what she was really famous for and highly regarded for, is just that, just a real formal elegance and refinement to her prints. Whereas Naoko Matsubara, it's more like that folksy jumble of visual information. But both of these are carving wood, which is very, very typical for a Japanese printmaker. So I'm going to move on to the next artist that's represented downstairs, and this is Mayumi Oda. Actually, she's known primarily as a painter before a printmaker, and she's done many, many paintings. She was born in 1941 and lives in Hawaii. One of the events that really informed her life was that she lived through the nuclear attacks on Japan. And that's just always, it's something, a part of her consciousness. So in addition to being an artist, she is an environmental activist, especially with things related to nuclear events, nuclear proliferation, things like that. So that is a big part of her work, is making people aware of environmental causes. And the other thing is she's very much into portraying the feminine. She's done many, many paintings of series of goddesses from different religious practices around the world, a lot of Hindu goddesses, goddesses within other Asian traditions. And so you'll see a lot of feminine imagery in her work, feminine bodies, women doing things. And also there's that recognition of the natural world and the environment. So here we have treasure ship on the river of our mind. And you have this female figure, she's on a boat on the river. It's like a dragon boat. And just the touches, like these really rich colors of red and orange. And again, the addition of gold. It just makes us a very rich image, thinking about, you know, in the imagination, what beauty is there. Talking about the process of the Mayumi Oto prints, these are actually screen prints. You'll see some of them labeled serigraphs, which is another name for screen print. And how these are done is that stencils are put on screens, usually of silk, of different weaves. So different weaves will get you different amounts of pigment going through. And then with a big squeegee, you'll just kind of draw the ink down over the screen, and the stencil will keep the ink from hitting those places that you want to stay plain. So again, looking at this print, we're looking at orange, red, and gold, 2 shades of red. And then also in printmaking, what happens when you layer colors, you get all the blends. But again, appreciate the fact that not one screen, but as many colors as you see were layered and registered on top of each other, printed over and over again in a large edition. So this imagery is of a type of imagery you'll see it a lot in her work. This, you know, kind of the voluptuous body, the woman doing something within the environment. And this next one, Merciful Sea, Dark Depths, another screen print. The only white left, that brilliance of that seashell on the lower right. And as I was doing some research, this is actually part of a diptych. There's another print that matches with the other side, and it's another female figure coming out of the waves. But again, you can recognize the elements of the waves, of the body, and how that all comes together. These 2 prints are a slightly different style. These are also screen prints in the garden, and they came here. And if you go down and see them, it's nearly life size of the flowers and the insects. And again, you can kind of appreciate the layers of color here, the repetition of these natural details like the flowers and the bees and the dragonflies. And this kind of, the imagery of this kind of stands out to me because it is, in my mind, kind of a more traditional Japanese imagery of flowers, things in nature, a lot like a lot of the bird prints and flower prints you might see by Japanese artists. And I particularly wanted to point out just the detail of this, I don't know, dragonfly or some large, a flying insect. And if you notice, even though this is a silk screen, there's just really that calligraphic effect of the way the lines are drawn to create the legs and the wings of this insect, and that glowing green, almost like a metallic green on it. And I noticed this just because I've looked at a lot of Japanese prints that are not necessarily supposed to be artistic in nature, but just more like scientific descriptions of flowers or birds or insects. And they all use this delicate style to portray these living animals and insects. And it stood out to me that I just really enjoy looking at the prints in their entirety, but then also kind of honing in on the way the artist draws these individual parts of nature, you know, like the little bees and dragonflies and blooms. I think it's really beautiful. So this is moving on to the last artist whose prints are represented downstairs. And this is Toko Shinoda's work. Shinoda lived from 1913 to 2221. She lived a very long life. She was active as a printmaker throughout it all. She was one of the artists designated as a living treasure. It's a designation that Japan gives to artists and craftspeople who have made such a great cultural contribution to the nation, that they're designated as a living treasure. Toka Shinoda started out as a calligrapher, and she also, part of that practice in Asia and in Japan is to write your own poetry and your own haiku and then illustrate it with your calligraphy. And as she was raised in Japan, it was fine to pursue things like art and literature and being a calligrapher and writing down your poems, because as a woman, because it was seen as part of being a very cultured female. It's just where the line was drawn as if you were trying to make it a profession and take it beyond anything that was beyond just being, behaving yourself and doing beautiful things at home, So she started to career-wise, running into a wall, wanting to use different type of language structures in her poetry and things like that. But she persevered and became very famous as a calligrapher, a poet, and then also as a printmaker using her imagery. So in a lot of her prints, they're very abstract. She was influenced by abstract expressionism, which was just coming to the fore in the early 20th century. Some of these strokes in these prints, it's like they are, in my mind, it's like they're way out of proportion. Like maybe it's just like the little bit of a larger character that you don't even see. But just the very broad brush strokes, or the appearance of broad brush strokes kind of falling out of the picture plane. And then this particular form, this vertical form, again, calligrapher's form, but what this reminded me of is this kind of contemporary artist to Shinoda is the Bird in Space by Constantin Brancusi, which I know these is a series of sculptures, very famous. But again, we're speaking of an era of very abstract art, and this form of Brancusi's, of the flying bird that doesn't really look like a bird per se, but he's just trying to capture that bullet-like movement through space. And I just could not get this out of my mind as I was looking at Shinoda's prints. So you might be looking for that repetitive shape. I'm not saying that she was copying that shape, but that it's just so similar that whenever I see it in her prints, I think bird. We were looking at this print downstairs, and Rahima Barber noticed that, well, she said that to her it looks like mountains. And I hadn't thought about that because I was still kind of obsessed with the aerodynamic bird shape. But I certainly see that, and I think there's a tendency in abstract art that sometimes we just enjoy it and appreciate it for the forms we see and the design. And then sometimes we do also see some pictorial image there as we look at it. But in any case, you can see, again, these kind of calligraphic forms and strokes of different widths and different intensities. Now, I want to point out, and this is kind of why I left Shinoda for last, is that this type of printmaking is lithography, and it is not traditionally a Japanese printmaking type. It's very Western printmaking type that was originally developed to print things like music and artwork for books and things like that. And lithography, as the name implies, it is printed by the matrix is stone, and the artist draws on the stone with either really greasy crayons or a really greasy kind of paint called tush. It's almost like it flows like a watercolor, but it's a very greasy ink. The reason why these greasy materials are used is that lithography works by water and oil repelling each other. So you prepare a stone. It's kind of a technical process, and then you print through water using oily ink, and that's how you get your images. Because these strokes, you can tell most of them have kind of that, like a watercolor type of brushed on look to them. We know that it was tush that she used. She probably stroked it on, possibly with calligrapher's brushes. We don't know. But the other thing about her lithography is, whereas the first three artists we looked at, or at least the first two, we know they're part of the artist tradition, where the artist is doing the entire process by themselves. Shinoda needed help doing this, and she did have a master printer helping her out. Kihachi Komura was the printer of her artwork. And again, when you have a master printer or someone helping you, if you're the artist and someone's helping you print, it's really considered a collaboration. So it's not like the master printer really has more of a secondary status. They're recognized as someone who is, whose help you have to have. However, because the artist originates the idea and puts it on the matrix, it's listed as their artwork. So this is, considered Shinoda's artwork, even though she had a helping hand printing, just like Hokusai and Hiroshige had a lot of people helping them print as well. This print, Kasawari, and I could not find a definition for that word. The closest I could get, it's either a place, and what kept popping up was the name of the bird, cassowary, but I don't think that's correct. So I'm sorry I can't explain what the title is to this image, but again, you see the tush work here, the brushwork with the tush, and something that makes lithography really challenging is that you can get just black darks, and then you see on the right the grays and beiges where it's just like a wash, and the very delicate values are there. It's very challenging to print that all at once to make sure that you get the darks are dark and the lights are light. Also, I need to point out that as two different colors of ink, it did require two matrices or stones in this case, and usually the light is printed first and then the dark. So that's what you see. The light band of gray on the far right was probably printed with the black, and what was different was not the color but just the intensity of that gray, because it was put on so heavily. The drawing was done so heavily on the left and so lightly on the right. And that really is a hallmark of master lithography, to get, like I said, the dark's very dark, the light's very light, all with one layer of ink. And this print is internal. To me, it is kind of an abstract depiction of what might be an internal struggle. An internal collision of thought or value. You see again very dark on the left, more of the light and the fluidity on the right side, and again those attenuated shapes, those abstract streaks, caught right in between, and you notice that red, like that red streak, that red arrow. Again, another application of ink. So another matrix was needed for that one. And then finally, this is flight. Again, the more I look at it, the harder it is to get that kind of mountains and flying birds idea out of my mind. But I think certainly with the way these images kind of fly out in either way, and again, that kind of abstraction of that movement on the left-hand side reminds us of flight. And again, I'll point out all the different gradations of ink as this was printed. It kind of really belies the process of lithography, is that you can paint with a paintbrush these light feathery strokes all you want, but in the end, the matrix is then treated with acid and treated with oil, and when you print, you are just rolling on ink really hard. And the darkness and the lightness that you see in the print has to do with your original drawing and not with the printmaking process. So if you don't get it right on the stone, you'll never get it right when you're printing it here. It will just, everything will get really thick and muddy. So I just encourage you to appreciate that kind of ethereal lightness of the streaks of ink and the washes of ink. And again, the addition of color, which is just one more process. So those are all of the prints that you will see in the basement. If you go down and look at them, I encourage you to do so. Are there any questions about any of these artists or prints, or any comments about what you enjoy about them? Yes.
Is the choice of paper important?
Yes, it is. In the woodblock prints, usually in the Japanese tradition, they use a very light paper because they usually print not on a press, but by hand. They use a round block of wood. It's called a baron. It's made of usually they make theirs out of bamboo, but they'll ink up the block, put the paper over it, and then rub it with that baron. And as you print, you can kind of see the ink telegraphing through. And so a thinner paper helps a great deal. It's also their paper is handmade, usually out of plant material. So that's what they use for woodblock. Lithography is a process that it uses a lot of pressure, and so lithography paper is generally machine-made, thicker, just a very sturdier, heavier paper. And then silk screen, you can be pretty choosy in your paper because you're not using a lot of pressure. You're just kind of squeegeeing ink through a screen onto the paper. That being said, I've done lithography with some pretty lightweight papers, different like found papers, alternative papers, like old papers out of books and things like that. But you have to stop and think, like the wear and tear on your paper depending on the printmaking method. Mm-hmm. Also, I want to point out that all these printmaking methods we teach at the KIA. We do lithography, we do screen printing, and we do relief woodblock, and we even have equipment to do Japanese woodblock and mokuhanga. Mary Brodbeck, a local artist who does exclusively Japanese printmaking, is doing a workshop next month, and she also will have some artwork at the Book Art Center, and then she'll be bringing her artwork here. So if you want to learn more about Japanese bookmaking, that's coming up in April. I mean, not bookmaking, printmaking. So those are some other opportunities. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Good afternoon. And I just want to say something, bring that down. I've been coming to a few of the art breaks recently, and I see a lot of the same faces, and I just want to give my appreciation to the people that decide to spend their Tuesday afternoons here and appreciate these presentations. So, just as Carol and Jeffrey Horvitz appreciate collecting work by Japanese artists that incorporate and celebrate a continuum of traditional techniques and vessels, this is the approach I'm going to take and introduce you to the 7 pieces by the 7 individual male artists currently on view in our Joy Light Gallery. I'll try to explain some of the technical ceramic aspects of these pieces to the best of my ability. And I'll put them in context of the body of work of each artist. Oh, sorry. I'm not seeing the whole, oh. Shannon, let's see here. Come here, real quick. Just so I can see the rest of that.
I think you're gonna have to use the no.
Nope.
I don't have an answer for you, Julie.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. I don't know why that cursor's not going over there. Okay.
Do you have a cursor anywhere?
No.
Yeah, I don't know how to scroll down on your text over there.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to ad lib some of this. But what I was going to say is, even though I've had my hands in clay for 40 years, I can't always answer technical questions. So if you're familiar with the exhibits we have presented in the Joylight Gallery, the ceramics are always stellar. Technically brilliant works of craftsmanship, and present the question. I'm always presented with the question of, how was that made? Oh, here's my part. Despite having almost 40 years of my hands in clay, I never claim to know exactly how every ceramic piece is created, but I'll try to cover my technical bases. So, this is might be tricky. This first piece is by Koji Kamada and untitled Stoneware with silver Temoku glaze. Temoku translates as heaven's eye. It's a traditional high temperature glaze that contains iron. And the earliest examples were from the Song Dynasty in China, and then the techniques were carried to Japan in the 12th century. The firing of this glaze can be very simple, as we might see in a Soji Hamada tea bowl, or even a piece coming out of our own KIA ceramics department kilns. It can be very technical, involving the control of the firing atmosphere in the kiln at certain temperatures, the control of the glaze. And I sure wish I could read the rest of this. With years of developing and experimenting with this Temoku glaze, the artist understands the ability to produce such amazing surfaces is certainly evident. The result of this alchemy of earthly material and heat produces a rainbow of colors. Kamada creates simple symmetrical forms, a clay canvas, to allow these glazes to flourish. They shimmer with depth, and the pot terminates with elegance at the rim, where the glaze thins at the lip and leaves a nice ring of gold. I was going to say on that, the piece is very humble when you see it from across the gallery, and the form is very simple and the profile is very simple. But then as you go closer to it, it just draws you into the depth of the color. These are other examples of the artist's work utilizing this oil spot Temoku glaze. And it's the flow of these glazes at high temperature that give this textured appearance. And this textured appearance is often referred to as hare's fur because it looks soft, like a hare's fur. And here, I like this little plump vessel. Another example of the use of traditional glaze is Takahito Watanabe piece. This porcelain water jar is glazed with celadon. Celadons are a wide-ranging type of glaze that most generally are transparent and colored with iron. They can be olive, jade green, blue, yellow, and in this case, it's crystal-like. This is one of the techniques. I'm not going to say I know with confidence how it's achieved, but one thing is when a glaze doesn't fit quite right, it can cause, when the glaze and the clay body itself don't fit quite right, it can cause it to craze. Also with application, glazes can craze. And this is an image I found on the artist's social media page. And I looked and saw this really thick application of glaze. And so I'm going to maybe conclude that that's how that crazing crackle surface is achieved. investigation. Because it's thickly applied transparent glaze, within the depth of the cracks of this glaze surface, you're actually seeing the color of the clay showing through. So this is another piece of his that you can see that dark chocolatey clay body, and thus it's influencing the color of the crazing. In the written statement for the piece in the gallery, there's mention of firing the work in a noborigama kiln. The part of that word, gama, means kiln, and you may have heard of the KIA on a gama kiln, which is a single chamber wood kiln, using wood as the fuel source. So Akihito Watanabe fires with wood, but the results are nothing like you would see coming out of most wood kilns. This kiln picture is for all my fellow wood fire people out there who like to look at kilns like I do. So the cylindrical vessels in this photo are called saggers, and the use of clay saggers is meant to protect the pot's surface from wood ash from the fuel landing on the pieces. The bottle form in the center of this photo will get these sagger rings then placed around it. It'll be capped off, and then additional saggers with pots inside would be placed on top and stacked up. The pots in the rear then are protected by this wall of saggers. So you can kind of see in this image and this one, some of the pieces packed in behind. This is another view of those saggers. With wood as a fuel source for firing kilns throughout history, using saggers was a very common practice. They were considered kiln furniture and they were disposable. So yes, these are made of clay. And then this is another picture for my wood fire friends. If you notice, we usually wad our pots going into the kiln. There's no wad marks on the bottom of these pieces, and it's probably a result of the kiln design that is minimizing the fly ash entering the chamber. And as seen in the previous photos, these pots were probably buried in the back of the kiln, so they didn't get a lot of ash results. And I want to say a word about this form, which is a water jar. These are utilitarian objects used during the tea ceremony, and this vessel with its red lacquer lid follows in a traditional lineage of water jars. And here's a few examples of water jars utilized as part of the tea ceremony. They too had characteristically flat lids, which are rather minimalist, and they too were made of lacquer. And just like the previous Temoku vase, Watanabe's pieces have a simple profile and a quiet presence, yet this complex surface that draws you in. Another piece in the gallery that exemplifies this quiet presence is the piece by Saruda Yoshitaka. This untitled spherical vase is a landscape rendered in an abstract way. The creation of a landscape is achieved with the gradation of the tonal range and utilizes an idea of atmospheric perspective, things extending into space at a further distance that appear lighter. So delicately choreographed and designed with a crispness that creates an illusion that from a distance, it appears to have a curvilinear surface. And then up close, the surface, you can just see it sparkle. And then the black that establishes a ground at the base of this piece is repeated within the interior glaze. And it's a common practice in vessel making and actually in any 3D, 2D artwork that the artist really wants to control the focus. And in this sense, the solid black interior redirects the viewer to the subtleties of the exterior glaze. Technically speaking, my guess is that the use of this more matte glaze is applied by spraying, and that helps create this pebbly surface. And again, I remind you of the simple forms that take on a reference to nature, whether it be shimmering snow, glistening water, or patterns of ice crystals. This is another piece by Saruta Yoshitaka. And the inward direction of this form and the contrast to the black glaze interior, again, he's focusing our attention on the exterior of the pot. And another form that demonstrates more of a graphic design sense and with some optical illusion occurring. And unlike the inward containment of the previous pieces, the energy of this bowl extends out into space beyond the rim. And I'd like to just draw a quick comparison between these pieces. While they're similar in form and creating a surface that's absorbing and quiet, meditative and peaceful, those who know me like to know I like to talk about pots and analyze pots. So that being said, I want to point out a difference between this contained vessel, the water jar in the center, and where I feel that the space and the volume is physically capped off, and it kind of changes the presence and the feel of the piece, but it immediately gives it sort of a functional designation. And then the two open forms, I feel they just, because they're open, they have more of a breath and a life in that volume. And another quick observation I want to make about these pieces is the way we're similarly drawn into the Toko Shinoda prints. And beyond the appreciation of abstract imagery and composition, the quietness draws us in, and we see these subtle textures as a result of process. Surface. This bowl is really lovely. It's by Taisuke Iguchi, and it's very elegant in its proportions, and it's generous in upward rising form and subtle in its oval shaped. Luscious and precious, and interior is this silver gold. It's this quiet surface. It's like pausing. I was thinking of being in the middle of a lake, reflecting sunlight on it. That's kind of the feeling I got from just the presence of that. And it's such a contrast to the elaborate detail of the exterior. I was anxious to see this really big. The unity of pattern and form is fundamental for this artist, and the detailed application of such a graphic display, which is quite labor intensive, and somewhere in the process there's glaze applied to it, but then it all seems to be erased through a process of sanding the pieces after they're fired. So it takes the surface back down to clay and exposing the material from which the vessel was formed. It's a smooth stone-like quality that just feels really genuine. And these are a couple other examples of Daisuke Iguchi's, again, showing the fundamental aesthetic that brings together surface design and form, and how that surface design can help exaggerate or celebrate the volume of a form. I like to call this the mystery piece, untitled piece by Kenzo Okada. Got that right. What's mysterious about this piece is not the piece itself, because it certainly has this beautiful presence in the gallery, but the artist. It was difficult for me to find much about the artist besides basic biographical information. And you'll see, because in my research, I found this vase on your left in the collection of the former ambassador to Japan, on a website that didn't really want me to copy it. So that's why the quality is not very nice. And then also in our ceramics studio, I found the copy 1984 issue of Ceramics Monthly where he's on the cover. So two very different pieces. And then these pieces, and really hard-edged sculpture. So there doesn't appear to be a stylistic theme really, or thread amongst any of these pieces. And the type of vessel, the surface, no glaze decisions offer any kind of similarity. So therefore, I'm not going to try to fill you in on Kenzo Okada, but rather discuss the merits of the piece itself. And the softness of this form is just really inviting, and it feels like a pot I want to cradle in my arms. It's a steady pattern and a wave, and as you go around the pot, you skip between thin lines and thick bands of color. It's neither glossy, or it's not glossy and reflective, and nor matte and dry, and it feels just right. I'm satisfied with enough of the material, the clayness being evident, and it has a well-worn surface that offers comfort, like a favorite pair of jeans. I'd like to move on to the one sculptural non-vessel piece in the exhibit. This is Takuro Nakamura, and I won't attempt to pronounce the title of the piece, but with a little Google Translate, I found it was a vessel that stopped being a vessel. In the gallery, I spent the most time with this piece because it offered so many surfaces and so many details and changed as you circle around the pedestal. Nakamura, as with several of these ceramic artists steeped in history, references a traditional technique known as katani ware, and it dates back several centuries and utilizes a specific color palette of red and green and blue and yellow and black. And what I like about this is that there's matte surfaces mingling with glossy surfaces, and blocks of colors sit beside pattern and like line work. And then just the beautiful raw brick-like clay also that is the canvas. And as a sculptural form, these two planes or screens are independent, and possibly, thanks to Rahima telling us this, that it was displayed in a rather random way because they're two separate pieces. And that may only be felt if you look at it from this perspective. Remember, three-dimensional work, be it sculpture or vessels, are meant to be viewed from multiple viewpoints. And even if you're only 5'2" like me, there's a way to look at things from a different view. This is a similar piece, also titled Vessel That Is Not a Vessel, and it implies a three-dimensional painting on rigid fabric. The imagery is slightly less abstract, but the images are presented in kind of a vague context. And this piece is called A Box, but Not a Box. I get the sense this artist is playing with form in a way to not create specific forms that might be recognized as vessels, but instead kind of a nonsensical play on recognizable objects. Again, creating flat surfaces for bold imagery and this really active, colorful glaze work. It's another piece. And then if you just look across at the print that's hanging, and Deb also talked about this print, has this sort of similar abstraction and this rigid and curvilinear line and form, and gold. Couldn't wait to talk about gold. And as Deb did mention, the technique called kintsugi. And traditionally it was used to repair objects or fill in cracks. And these are centuries old tea bowls. The use of gold adds a value and brings attention to the flaw, and it creates a random line. It can be reminiscent of calligraphy or a river or a crack in the earth. And even Akihito Watanabe on the left uses the kintsugi technique to highlight with gold leaf the lip of a cup. And I had to admit, the first time I walked in the gallery, and when you look to your right, saw this print and immediately thought, kintsugi. There's that other example of use of that gold. So again, steeped in tradition. Okay, and as you might have guessed, I saved my favorite piece in the exhibit for last. Although this is not in the exhibit. This is a wood-fired piece by Ken Matsuzaki, and it's a traditional square bottle form that has this landscape quality, with the opaque surface, thick with wood ash, and the upper part has this transparent luminescence, kind of like the morning sky. This piece is, the morning sky this morning too, so beautiful. This piece is not part of the exhibit. This one is. This is the Ken Matsusaki bottle in our show. Just as with the previous example, this piece also has an abstracted reference to landscape, whether you think of the grandeur of snow-capped mountains or the snow atop a pine tree in your own yard. The vertical ribs give it a sense of height and energy extending skyward, and the flow of the glazes is watery, translucent, and leaves exposed just the slightest hint of the raw clay at the bottom. The white glaze is made of feldspar, and it's very thick and stiff. And the glaze at the lower part of it is called a ribe. And ribe dates back to the Momoyama period of the late 16th and early 17th century. And it's a transparent green that can be historically viewed in combination with iron brushwork. And again, this oftentimes the white feldspathic glaze. And this is a Matsusaki plate made in the Aribe tradition. So historically speaking, the style and the approach was loose and not repetitious, and the pieces were intended for everyday use. What was considered Japanese folk pottery, or a celebration of everyday objects, became known as the Mingei tradition. And pieces were not formal, or they weren't created with precision and perfection, but rather reflected a spontaneous approach to their execution. Again, beauty in the irregular, the spontaneous, and forsaking control for instead yohen, which means the blessings or transformations thanks to the kiln. And I wanted to share a few details of the images on this glaze in the piece in the show, where the glazes blend together and there's this little crystal growth, and just the recognition and the respect for the exposed naturalness of the clay at the bottom. And this particular print hung nearby in the gallery, and it was also referenced the Mingei tradition in the sense of the spontaneous process. And as Deb said, just drawing on a wood block, and that's what becomes the piece. So, and this too has that sort of captivating naturalness and flow, like a lot of the Mingei pots we see. So I'm going to indulge you with a few more of his pieces in all their wood-fired splendor. I want to describe the firing process a little bit, though. The kiln, again, is fueled with wood. And unlike my previous description of the wood firing, the collection of ash on the work is desired. And the ash can build up and it can melt out into a glassy glaze or create surfaces that are unique to the placement in the kiln, the temperature achieved, and even the wood and type of clay used. And flame can also just paint the surface of a pot in a wood-fired kiln. So personally, I'm up here talking about Japanese pots because they've had such an influence on my own artistic journey. These are all Matsusaki pots. And this Mingei tradition or aesthetic, which celebrates craft and functional objects that are born, not made, was really revived by the publication in 1972 of the essays by Suetsu Yanagi, and titled The Unknown Craftsman was the book, A Japanese Insight into Beauty. And it was, these were translated, you can see, translated by his friend Bernard Leach. So these pieces are not simply trying to represent nature in an object. Instead, the ideal is to be present with nature and to be able to see nature within the object as well as beyond or surrounding the object. It's in an element of and blends with the natural world. There's another. I really just wanted to see these pieces really big. And so while this image of Ken Matsusaki's vase might appear kind of commercial or overly produced, it does represent this idea of not separating the object from the natural world. And I just want to say, if you haven't already seen the show in the Joylet Gallery, just please go down, take some time. And the wonderful thing about the gallery is you do just get this sense of peace and calm. It doesn't matter what show is ever in that gallery. I always get that sense. So, you know, please do go down and see the gallery. So, and thank you. Any questions? Thanks for being here, and thanks for the people at home.